It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP and Chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, writer and broadcaster, Steve Richards, and The Sun's political and environment correspondent, Natasha Clark. Today.
We don't sleep 3 nights, and now we hope maybe we go to another country and maybe we stay there.
Would you offer your spare room to a refugee? Diesel tops £1.75 a litre as the cost of living crisis bites. This coach operator wants the Chancellor to act. Persuading the Saudis to increase oil production could ease prices. But should the Prime Minister meet the leaders of a country that executed 81 men in one day last week? The battle for hearts and minds in Russia. Are sanctions helping or hindering Putin? Well, let's start with the story that we heard there in the headlines, and this is the UK government's response to what's fast becoming a refugee crisis as people leave Ukraine in their millions. Well, today there is a government scheme opening here in the UK where people can register an interest in providing a home for a refugee. People would get £350 a month if they did open up their homes to a refugee. So my question to the panel is, would you give a room to a refugee, Robert?
I'd seriously consider it. I've got personal issues that we'd have to resolve. I'd certainly like to do something to help children because there'll be children who are orphaned. We had the kinder transport in the Second World War, and Sir Nicholas Winton, who organised that, had a famous saying, which is, if it's not impossible, there must be a way to do it. And I hope we can have a kinder transport for children. And I noticed that the Education Secretary has said he's going to try and find 100,000 extra places for Ukrainian children. And I'm very pleased that a head teacher in my constituency found one just for a constituent who managed to get, by miracle from God, from the Ukraine back to Harlow over the weekend.
How about you, Emily? Would you have a refugee in your home?
I'd certainly play my part, but I do think that it's not likely to come to that, because I think that most people who want to come over from the Ukraine have friends and family already here, and that's why they want to come. And I think, really, that this is a kind of classic Gove, snatch the headlines, change the subject. What we should be focusing on is the fact that it is so hard for people to come here and that they still haven't got the visas sorted out and they haven't got the way in which you can get families in here. So let's get that sorted out, and we'll see what happens. But I think what will happen is that when we eventually do get people through, they will be going to seek to live with friends and family.
But if somebody didn't have friends and family and wanted to come to the UK, would you take them in?
Yeah, no, I mean, as I say, I play my part in that. I don't have a problem with it. But as I say, I think that this is a way of kind of changing the subject, but we shouldn't be changing the subject. It's a classic Gove thing. Put it in the headlines, it goes in all the headlines, everyone's talking about it over the breakfast table, and they're no longer talking about the fact that Priti Patel has let us all down by not having a proper system for getting people into the country.
We'll talk about the two systems in a moment, but I just want your thoughts, Steve, on whether you would open up your home to a refugee.
Yeah, I think so, but we're in a pretty... I was with some friends last night, all of whom live in houses and all the kids have left.
So there are spare rooms.
So we're in quite a kind of rarefied situation where we could do it. But I do agree with Emily that I don't think that's going to be the issue. There will be, if needs be, these rooms available. All these friends, with apparent sincerity, said they'd do it. But the issue is also one, I think, of logistics, way beyond that. The liaising with local authorities, the provision of school places, the availability of GP surgeries when you can't get through at the best of times. So there are huge logistical issues which overwhelm this thing of, oh, would you take them in? Because I don't think that would be the problem.
Natasha, how about you? Do you have space and would you share it?
It's a lot. But yes, of course, if that was an option, then of course. But yes, I think, obviously, you know, we're seeing this scheme opening up to not just immediate family members, was what the scheme is really focused on so far. It's opening up to everybody, which obviously means that companies can look to sponsor people, that people can look to sort of match up their spare rooms if they're lucky enough to have one. You know, it's all going to be about the numbers that are now going to be allowed to sort of, you know, come in. However, Priti Patel's been really criticised the past few days for not opening up enough. Is this going to be enough to satisfy the critics? Basically saying that we need to do more, we need to be cutting down those passport checks and those biometric checks that everybody in the region at the moment is going to have to do before they can even get to the UK.
I just think it's putting the cart before the horse. I just think they just need to get the system sorted out for getting people here, and we're so far behind in terms of getting that sorted out. We're becoming it's a national disgrace.
Of course, Emily, Labour isn't suggesting that security checks or visas should be scrapped. So
no, so what we're saying is that when people come here, we need to put them on a list. You know, we need to take their biometrics. We need to know who they are, where they're going, who's going. I mean, because we're going to have vulnerable people. You know, we know that when there is a terrible disaster like this and there's a major shift of people across the world, that this is exactly the situation when people can get exploited. And we've seen the charities. I mean, those of us who've been working in this field for years know this. When this kind of disaster happens, there are vultures who come in and exploit the situation. We need to make sure that the children who are coming in with their parents, you know, that the elderly are being looked after. We need to make sure that we can do that. But what we shouldn't be doing is holding people back from coming into the country.
Robert?
I accept that sometimes the immigration service is a bit like a hippopotamus stuck in the mud. And yes, the visas should be very careful, you know, very much quicker. I do believe there has to be some security checks. But Steve made exactly the point, which is one of the reasons why you can't just say everyone can come here willy-nilly, even though I want to be as compassionate as possible, because there are huge logistics. So, for example, we already have a lot of Afghan refugees. I strongly welcome that. They're in a lot of hotels. We're looking after them. So, again, if you're having many thousands of Ukrainian refugees, which I want to happen, you have to have the school places, you have to have the GP surgeries. Michael Gove has said, and we'll hear later in Parliament, that there will be money provided for local councils, significant amount of money to be able to...
£10,500 per
yes, to be able to do this. And the details will come through over, I suspect, over the next 24, 48 hours, if not all, in Parliament this afternoon. But the logistics of this are enormous, and that's why sometimes these things do take a bit of time to implement.
But we did need to have a special scheme, like we had a special scheme for Hong Kong, a resettlement scheme for Afghans. We knew this was coming. We knew this was coming for weeks, if not months. We really should have had our act together, rather than be many weeks down the line and be scrabbling around to try and get.
I think we've done. I think we're proud of our record. We've given over 200 million in aid to Ukraine. We led the world in terms of early provision of them with lethal weapons. We've led the way in terms of sanctions.
I'm not talking about that.
Yes, but you're implying that we've been behind in terms of Ukraine. Actually, I think Britain has led the world, and I think we should be very proud of that. It is true. It is a very slow process, and it needs to be quicker. And I've acknowledged that and accepted that. But this is not an easy thing because all the logistics.
I think there's two things we're behind on, and I take on board the points that you've made about the other assistance. But there's two things that it looks like we've almost been caught napping. One is on sanctions. It's like we've been scrabbling around at the last minute to kind of get the mechanisms together for sanctions, which we should have done years ago. And on refugees, we just look cold-hearted, and we're not cold-hearted.
We're not being cold-hearted. We've said we're going to have 200,000 plus refugees here. We're going to be providing many millions of pounds to
if it's not cold-hearted, then it's incompetent.
The public to look after refugees and to councils. I don't think that's cold-hearted. I think that's actually we're extending an opening arm to these refugees. It's something we should be proud of.
I want to show you this tweet. This is a tweet that has been published today, and it appears to show that squatters have occupied the mansion, which is believed to belong to one of the Russian oligarchs who has been now made subject to sanctions by the UK government. So reportedly, squatters are in a mansion that is said to belong to one of those Russian oligarchs. Steve, are the squatters right?
Well, I think, again, there has to be some scale of organisation over all these things. I don't know, that Michael Gove wants to use these houses to house some of the refugees. And again, that's a sort of symbolic thing because it doesn't address the scale of the issue. So I think the real problem at the moment is this is all being rushed. Yes. We know that last week Priti Patel was sending out a different signal. Then some of the Tory supporting papers, the Mail and the Spectator magazine, really went for them. And only after that was this scheme rushed out, which we're going to hear more detail about today. So I think the issue is not so much what you do with the oligarchs' houses, although it is, you know, they can't sit there empty. They might as well be used. But that is a minor thing compared to how we get people in speedily who want to be here and then provide them with the level of services required. And this has been so rushed, it's not at all clear what those answers are yet. Well,
let's just look at the numbers. So far, some 4,000 visas have been granted through the Ukrainian family scheme, which allows family and friends of Ukrainians currently in the UK to have a visa. That's out of some 32,000 applications. And we heard from Michael Gove yesterday, who suggested there could be tens of thousands of people coming under the sponsorship scheme. Natasha, do you think it is now going to speed up? Things are moving online for family visa applications from tomorrow. Have the government now got a grip on this?
They've started to, certainly. I think speeding up this whole process, like everybody has mentioned, is definitely the key. It needs to be done much quicker. And obviously all of these checks, which the government are insistent absolutely have to be done, they are worried about the security risks of people coming in from the region who might have ulterior motives. They are worried about that. That is something that they insist has to continue to happen. As long as that does continue to happen, there needs to be other checks to, make sure that those people don't, and obviously the people that really need it are the people that really are able to come into the country. Obviously, the interesting thing about homes for using the oligarchs' homes for refugees is obviously there's not that many of them. So we're going to have to open our arms up to people from Ukraine, and I'm sure the British public, as they have done in the past, will welcome many thousands of them.
Emily, what do you make of this idea about using oligarchs' homes to house refugees? Do you support it?
Yes, fine. Fine with me. It just needs to be organised. I agree with Steve. I mean, it's just headlines is one thing, but actually we just need to have it organised. There needs to be proper leadership, and we're just not seeing that at the moment.
And Robert, we heard that Michael Gove was talking about this idea. Supposedly he's been pushing it in Cabinet, but even he acknowledges that there are huge logistical and legal aspects to the idea of seizing an oligarch's home for refugees that would be hard to overcome. So is it just?
I'm very happy that big homes are used for refugees, but we can't kind of live under some kind of Robespierre French Revolution system where kind of homes are seized by goodness knows who. It has to be done according to the rule of law. Absolutely, because otherwise you set an unfortunate precedent, and who goes where next. So as long as it's done with the rule of law, and I have no problem with it at all. And I think symbolism matters. Yes, this is a symbol, but symbolism matters because they're saying to the people like Putin and all these oligarchs, we're seizing a home and we're giving it to Ukrainian refugees, and it's a very powerful symbol to send out to the.
I think it's also that because so many of these oligarchs are close friends, and and close to Putin, and many of them, frankly, have his gold, looking after his money for him. And so going for those people is also a way of going for Putin. And that's why it's so important to have individualised sanctions and to have them that are effective.
OK. Well, we know that one impact of the war in Ukraine is on the cost of oil and gas, pushing up prices again and exacerbating the cost of living crisis. We can talk now to Richard Bamber. Richard runs as part of Anthony's Travel, a family-owned coach company. Richard, thank you so much for being with us. Can you just talk us through the predicament you're facing, the impact of those increased prices are having on your business?
Firstly, thanks for having me on. Our sympathies firstly go out to people in Ukraine. The situation is terrible, so we mustn't get carried away with costs of things, because the human plight that what they're facing is far more excessive to the bills that we're having to put up with. The impact on ourselves has been it's quite drastic. Fuel has been escalating for a considerable time anyway. It started in September, but between September and December, we've seen a 15 pence a litre rise on fuel, and that's excluding VAT. Now, since the start of this crisis, we've seen fuel now go for a delivery that I take in January, which was excluding VAT, 115 pence a litre. And now if we had the same amount of fuel today, the cost would be 155 pence a litre, excluding VAT. So on a delivery for ourselves, that's a £6,000 rise on one delivery. But fuel was rising beforehand anyway. The situation in Ukraine has just absolutely compounded the issue.
So what does that mean for your business? Is this sustainable?
It's not sustainable. The problem with the coaching industry is we're often lumped together with our friends in the bus industry, but in fact they receive a type of fuel duty rebate called BSOG. The coach industry doesn't receive that sort of rebate. So what we're stuck with is we give quotations that we're on contracts for 3 years with local authorities, county councils and so on. And our prices are just not keeping up. So it ends up now that some of the hires that we took on in good faith and for clients, senior citizen groups and so on that haven't got the money to go and pay extra, we're now running some of these hires now either breaking even or running at actual loss. And if it carries on the same escalator that we're doing, it's just going to get to a point that we can't serve these runs anymore because it's just not financially viable to do so.
OK, Richard, stay with us if you would. I just want to get the thoughts of our panel on this. I mean, you hear the plight of Richard there, Robert. What do you want the government to do?
Well, this is what I hear in my constituency. So I've had constituents who've told me they've had to sleep in car parks overnight because they can't afford the commute home to drive home because of the cost of fuel. A mother who said to me that she couldn't, she was thinking about home educating a child because of the cost of driving her child to school. And if you look at the prices, just take the average motorist up by £16 to £16 to £20 every time they fill up at the pump. Road hauliers up something like £160, £60 for white van men and women. So it is a hideous cost, and it impacts on, it's not just about motorists, it impacts on food prices, businesses, transportations, everything. So I welcome that the government have frozen fuel for the past 11, 12 years. I campaigned on that all my life in Parliament here. Yes. Fuel duty. I absolutely welcome that, but they've got to go further. And what we need to do is either reduce VAT or reduce fuel duty, just as they've done in Ireland and in New Zealand. In Ireland last week, they cut, I think, 15, 20 cents off the prices at the pumps. But this is literally unaffordable for people. It's the biggest cost for millions of people. And we may not like it that we are a great car economy, but we are. That's a fact of life. And we have to deal with the world as it is, as well as the world we'd like it to be.
Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you make is a good one, and it's fundamentally this, is that whilst we do want to move away from an economy that's dependent on fossil fuels, the reality is that we don't have that at the moment. We need to move to that, and we need to make sure that we have our own energy security, because energy security is national security, in my view. We need to be self-dependent much more, but we aren't there at the moment. And now, right now, people don't have a choice. You know, they need to have their car in order to get their kids to school or to get to work, and we need to be realistic about that. Just like the woman who came to see me at my surgery on Saturday, who literally couldn't afford to pay for water. You know, these are choices that people don't have. They just have to do it, and they cannot make ends meet. And whilst we have inflation on food and national insurance and energy prices and everything else going on, what we need is, and I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but we need to have some leadership from the government. They need to not be making matters worse, as they are, by rising national insurance, which is what they're going to do. Are they going to put up prescription charges? Are they going to put up road tax? Don't even know that. I mean, that's something that may come up. They can make matters better or they can make matters worse, but at the moment they're doing nothing.
Natasha, do you think that this is something the Chancellor's going to have to move on, because he's got his spring statement coming up quite soon? We're hearing that he's not minded to make any big changes at that point, but do you think that's sustainable?
The Treasury always are not minded to make big changes until they are, so I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens there. But obviously, Rishi Sunak is in a really, really tricky spot. Don't envy him in the slightest, but he has really got to look at exactly the cost of living on the very people that are electing him. And some of those stories that you just shared, both of you, about your constituents, are really going to be biting home in the next weeks to come. A cut to fuel duty is obviously one of the options that the Chancellor has. A cut to VAT on fuel, which is obviously incredibly high and, has already gone up as well because of the amount that fuel has risen, means that the Treasury is now taking much more in. Emily, would you support a cut to VAT on fuel, you think?
So I think certainly our policy is to cut VAT on energy. And because of exactly the same thing. So the energy prices have gone up so much, the government's been making loads of money because of VAT, so we can have a cut to that. But what we've always said is that whatever announcements that we would make as the opposition, we have to have it costed. But I wouldn't, if the Treasury hasn't got a special group, working on fuel prices and prices at the petrol tank, and working out how they can give some assistance, then frankly, what's the purpose of it?
Just two things, if I could say.
Robert.
First of all, it's not right to say the government hasn't done anything, because although I've been very open with you, I want the government to do more. They've massively increased the living wage, so that helps people £1,000. They provided £9 billion worth of taxpayers' money to try and deal with energy bills, including £150 tax rebate. No, because you've also got the £150 council tax rebate. The loan is £40 for 5 years, but it makes a big difference.
Loan, which was introduced on the basis that
they've hugely increased the scope of the warm home discount. They've had the fuel duty freeze, as I say. So there are a lot of things that the government have done. I just want them, because this is such a crisis, to do more. And don't forget, the government have raised a lot more money at the moment in terms of VAT with petrol because of how expensive it's been. So they could use some of that money to return it to the taxpayer.
I'm sorry to talk.
Inflation freaks out governments in a way that virtually no other economic challenge does. And in the early 70s, the then Heath government, when oil prices quadrupled, really didn't know what to do. They were against incomes policies, then they put in incomes policies, then they started subsidising prices. And it was really interesting. I interviewed Roy Hastley a couple of years ago, who was Consumer Affairs Secretary for the Labour government in the mid-70s. And he said he had the surreal experience of waking up each day to decide the price of bread because they were subsidising the price. And he got a laugh from the audience because it seemed so absurd, because no one was used to this inflation. And here we are now talking about how we subsidise the price of fuel.
That's what they're doing in Portugal as well. They're deciding that on a weekly basis, exactly how much they're going to subsidise it.
Exactly.
And, Rishi Sunak is under so much pressure from, like you say, Ireland and France.
Inflation plays havoc with economies and also politics.
Talking about pressure on the Chancellor, I want to show you this graph that we can take a look at, which shows public sector net debt as a percentage of GDP. And if you take a look at that graph, you can see it's creeping up so that debt is almost 100% of GDP. I mean, this is the point, isn't it, Robert? The Chancellor is looking at either there's a huge hit on personal finances, household incomes, or potentially another big hit on the public finances.
Well, I absolutely accept that, and we're over £1 trillion in debt. We've spent 400 billion plus on COVID, so very difficult choices. That's why everything I've said is to try and say I'm not asking for new money, but to use existing money. And the government made a very tough decision to cut overseas aid. That's £4 billion that they've saved to that. Maybe they could use some of that to help cut the cost of living, particularly for the lower paid, because that's a £4 billion that they've saved from the budget for the coming year. So I've tried to do it in a way where I'm not asking for new money, but to use the money. And I even mentioned that the fact that the government have increased revenues in terms of the VAT. But I accept, and also in terms of the NI thing, absolutely a difficult issue. But also, we've got to spend £34 billion on the NHS for the COVID backlog and social care. Now, that is the public want the money spent on the NHS. There is an umbilical cord between the British people and the National Health Service, and they want that money spent. So if you don't, you can't just say, well, you're going to cut NI, but not have a genuine alternative to find £34 billion for the National Health Service.
Emily?
So what we said is that we should look again at the way in which we tax people, and we should do it in a much fairer way. Yes, of course, we need to be putting more money into the National Health Service. It's exhausted, it's underfunded, chronically understaffed, and of course we need to put more money into it. But we need to do it in a way whereby we step back and actually take a radical look at what's fair and what's not fair. You know, the fact that people who earn less money pay relatively more tax than those at the top end is just not fair. You would agree with me on that. We need to look at this again, and we need to make matters fairer. But you know, we make, I think, completely helpful and you know, suggestions to the Treasury and say, look, if you haven't got a plan, here's a plan. Cut VAT on fuel bills. You know, you've already made a load of money on VAT on fuel bills. Why don't you have a windfall tax on the companies that are digging the oil out of the ground?
Not yet a commitment from Labour to cut VAT on petrol and diesel.
No, I mean, I think that, as I say, what we need to do is anything that we put forward, we do make sure is costed properly.
Okay. But that windfall tax will cover energy bills, your
Yes.
energy bills, but it won't cover the 34 billion we need for the NHS.
No. And we've also talked about, investing money in making sure that we insulate homes properly. I mean, for heaven's sake, if we do a proper retrofit of homes, then our gas bill will go down by 15%. I mean, you can do this if you have proper, if you think these things through, if you think a little bit more long-term than we've seen from this government.
We've still got Richard with us, and I'd like to get your thoughts, Richard, on what you've heard from the panel today and whether you think that anything that's been suggested is going to make much difference to you.
There's a couple of things that were suggested, but I'm part of the RHA, which represents coaches, it represents the haulage sector and the van sector. I'd like to see a twofold approach. Firstly, the VAT cut, whilst that it would be very, very welcome by residents, domestic users, it certainly wouldn't be worth anything for businesses, as myself reclaims VAT. So we'd like to see for the residential users a cut in VAT, but the RHA are proposing a essential user rebate, which is for the van sector, commercial vans, for haulage, for coaches, of 15 pence per litre that they're able to reclaim. That would go some way to helping out on a short-term measure. We, as industries, we desperately need that duty cut to give us that competitive that we can operate again, we can operate successfully. If it carries on in a scale, it's going, all the prices are going to go up and we're adding to inflation. We're going to end up with delivery prices going higher and higher. The costs are just going to get out of control. So we definitely need an essential user rebate. And then going forward as a country, we've got to become more self-sustainable and we mustn't become too reliant on other countries. We must look at the resources that we've got.
OK, Richard, look, thank you so much for being with us, Richard Bamber, and all the best with your business. Thank you for being there. Now, something that Richard talked about there is not being too dependent on other countries. Well, one thing that might help bring prices down is, in fact, getting the Saudis to produce more oil. We can take a look at this headline in the Mail, which says Boris could visit Saudi Arabia this week, pleading for action to keep oil prices down amid Ukraine crisis, despite the kingdom executing 81 people. Now, we haven't had news of a visit from the Prime Minister to Saudi Arabia confirmed, but it's obviously something that's being talked about. Robert, do you think that's the right thing?
Well, sadly, yes, because whilst Saudi Arabia is certainly not my cup of tea, and I hate some of the things that go on in that country, I really do, the fact is that where do we get the oil from if we're trying to reduce the dependency of Europe on Russia? Do you get it from Iran? Do you get it from Venezuela? I mean, whatever choice you look at, you're looking at the frying pan or the fire, in essence. And at least Saudi Arabia has some dealings with the West. There are some reforms coming through, however abhorrent some of the things that go on in that country, particularly capital punishment. I just don't think we have any alternative.
Emily?
I mean, I think that if you're going to, you need to talk to OPEC. And in order to talk to OPEC, you talk to Saudi Arabia. I mean, I appreciate that. But I don't think that it's in the interest of OPEC for the world economy to take a nosedive. So I think that at a time like this, it is important for OPEC to increase its production. I think that it's in the interest, so he always says so, but Mohammed bin Salman, the guy in charge of Saudi Arabia, wants to pivot to the West, wants it to be somewhere where people feel relaxed to go and visit, where businesses want to invest. So I don't see why, whilst on the one hand we do want OPEC to increase its oil, why we need to kowtow to the Saudi Arabians in the way that we do, and why we don't stand up to them when it comes to abuses of human rights or the dismembering of journalists in Turkey, the way in which the Saudis were responsible, recently, or frankly for what they've been doing in Yemen. I mean, don't get me started.
If there was a Labour Prime Minister right now, would a Labour Prime Minister be going to Saudi to ask them to increase oil production?
What we would be doing is we would be wanting to be part of an international effort to ensure that OPEC, for OPEC to increase production, of course, at a time like this, that's what's needed. But let's not get that muddled up with us being consistent and clear about what we think about human rights abuse.
The biggest OPEC producer is Saudi Arabia, so whether we like it or not, we have
that.
To deal with.
But it isn't. No, but that's what.
Sometimes better to deal with the devil you know, as the saying goes, however uncomfortable it may be.
Well, there's an international mechanism which is, as I say, through OPEC, and Saudi Arabia leads that mechanism, and that's how you go about it. But what are you going to do?
Steve, do you think this is a pragmatic choice by the Prime Minister if he does indeed go to Saudi? Is there an alternative?
No, I don't think there is, and we might as well be honest. There is in this crisis sort of layers of morality. I mean, so at the very top, as William Hague put it the other day, the ultimate moral mission for the West must be to avoid a nuclear war. And that's why there's no no-fly zone, for example. But that is a tough moral decision. And similarly with this, there is a supply crisis in the immediate future. So you have to deal with it. And if you're not going to take Russian fuel for the time being, you have to look elsewhere. And you might as well be honest about it. You then have to deal with Saudi Arabia as the biggest, as you were saying, units. They are the biggest supplier. So it is pragmatic. And in the short term, it seems to me necessary.
Natasha?
Absolutely. We're obviously still waiting for the Prime Minister's energy strategy, which we're told will have some short, medium and long-term goals. And obviously, you know, I think we all want to focus on how we can increase our domestic energy, but that just takes years. We need some action now, and we need something from the Chancellor, you know, in the government now, and that is something that they can be doing in the short term. The Treasury, there are lots inside the Treasury that believe that this is going to make a big difference, actually more of a difference than anything else that the Chancellor could do, for example.
And we've just been talking about businesses being destroyed because they can't afford petrol costs, and we talked about our own constituents. If we get more oil, the price of oil, international oil, will go down. And the problem is at the moment it's so high and it's being fed through, and that's why we have to do, not just for Britain, but right across.
But the last time Labour was in power, I was in the Department for Energy and Climate Change, and we were talking about the importance of having, you know, being independent as a nation when it came to energy, and we had a plan in terms of massively increasing the amount of wind power. For example, Saudi Arabia, we're the Saudi Arabia of wind. Everybody always says it's it's a silly joke, but it is kind of true. But we didn't go ahead fast enough with that. When the Conservative government came in, Osborne slowed it down. It shouldn't have happened. We should have carried on powering ahead with it, and we'd be in a very different position now.
But is there a question of an element of we are where we are? And,
I understand that.
And we've heard the impact on businesses.
No, listen, we want to be pragmatic about this. But as I say, I don't think that we on the one hand have to be pragmatic, so pragmatic that we don't tell people the truth about what we think about some of their behaviour.
I mean, that is a point, isn't it? It's very uncomfortable for the Prime Minister to be going and possibly shaking hands with Mohammed bin Salman after 81 executions at the weekend.
Yeah, it's terrible. But if you're going to target for now and prioritise the targeting of Russian exports of energy, you have to go somewhere else. And as I say, there are levels and layers of moral calculations here, and this is one of them.
Well, let's take a look at another element of this. This is a BBC News story from today that we can take a look at. And the headline says, Ukraine crisis, US warns China against helping Russia. Now, this is on the basis of reports from an unnamed US official who suggested that Moscow had asked Beijing for military assistance for the war in Ukraine, and then that warning back from the US that if China were to intervene in that way, then it may prompt some reaction. I guess the question, Robert, is if China were to intervene in some way, what could the West do?
Well, it's pretty frightening. I mean, you were talking about World War III and nuclear war. I mean, if China get involved on the side of the Russians, I genuinely don't know what the answer is. Would we have sanctions against China in the same way that we've done against the Russians?
I mean, that Chinese could be potentially crippling for the UK
exactly,
economy.
because I mean, Chinese control, I think, a significant part of the world's lithium supply. Just to take one example, which goes in all mobile phones and batteries. And it's just frightening to think about. As I understand it, the Chinese have denied this, from what I heard on the news this morning. But I think this will require serious, no doubt it's gone on, serious response from the government.
You're right. We should say that the Chinese have said that this is pure disinformation and denied it completely. But Emily, if China were to intervene in some way, are there options that the West could, in a way that the West could respond, and what would they be?
I don't think that China is going to intervene, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that it would be kind of in China's interest for Russia to be isolated and to be dependent on China for, their only friend. And then, China indeed would then benefit from all of the oil and the gas turning around and, them getting those resources instead. I think a supplicant Russia to China would be to China's interest, but China doesn't intervene in these sorts of situations. I can't see it happening. But it's a straw in the wind that the Russians are asking, and it does tend to show that the war is not going their way, is not going the way that they planned, and they're floundering around. And that is another reason why we have to be really bold, we have to be consistent, we have to be strong and stick with what we're doing and not allow ourselves to get rattled.
But the point is, Steve, that by the West's own admission, there's a limit to the action it's prepared to take because it doesn't want to bring itself into direct conflict with Russia, NATO, but of course just this idea of avoiding escalation. Do you think China may actually lead to escalation in some way?
Well, it would if they got involved in the way that I gather they have so far said they're not going to. And this is where, I mean, of course, it's a horror story in Ukraine at the moment. But the danger of escalation is the one that has to be addressed again and again and again. Because if there is, in effect, as Robert was saying, you know, world war with nuclear weapons, the game's up for everybody. And that, in the end, I think has to be borne in mind at every single junction of this crisis. And so far has been. So there have been these passionate calls in Ukraine for the West to impose a no-fly zone, and the West rightly hasn't done it, because that would lead, possibly, to world war. And so I think whatever China does, that has to be borne in mind at every second of this crisis.
Natasha?
Absolutely, and I think Emily's point about sort of it showing that Russia's not doing quite as well as it perhaps hoped. We don't know exactly when this request to China went, but you know, if they're already asking for extra help, whether that's militarily, whether that's weapons, whatever it might be, it shows that things aren't going quite as well for Putin as he might have expected at this point. But you know, like you said, Steve, absolutely, you know, we need to do all we can to sort of de-escalate this. But that is the problem: is that Russia are going to continue to escalate it, and we saw that with the strike overnight yesterday nearer to Poland. You know, we've seen Sajid Javid on the round this morning saying just one toe cap into a NATO country and this is all going to get incredibly messy.
Of course, the push has been up till now on this political, diplomatic, economic isolation for Russia. So what is the perspective of the Russian people with how things are going? We can speak to Jenny Hill, who is our Moscow correspondent. Jenny, thank you for being with us. First, I just want to get your take on peace talks that are taking place between Russia and Ukraine. There seems to be a sense of some optimism.
Well, I suppose the fact that they're still talking gives us all a little glimmer of hope. And you're right. I mean, the noises coming out of Moscow of late have been very optimistic. We've been told that the two sides' positions have got closer together. But I think we have to question that narrative from the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin needs Russians to believe that he's serious about these negotiations. He wants Russians not to think that this special military operation of his in Ukraine is going to go on forever. He needs to reassure them that it isn't. I think we also have to look at the fact that the rhetoric from Moscow continues to be belligerent. State TV parroting its lines that Ukraine is developing biological weapons, that it wants to acquire nuclear weapons, both of which to use against Russia. Then we have to look at the fact that Russia's stance hasn't really changed in that it's still demanding of Ukraine what it knows Ukraine does not at this stage want to give, and that is, in effect, chunks of territory. That's before you consider Vladimir Putin's potentially wider aims. We know he's deeply concerned about NATO, its architecture, its structure within Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. I think what we can, though, be clear about is that Moscow will blame Ukraine if these negotiations go nowhere. We heard from the Foreign Ministry here this morning saying that further progress is dependent now upon Kyiv's willingness to compromise.
OK, Jenny, stay with us, because you mentioned there the messaging from the Kremlin. What people in Russia are hearing about this war is very different to what people elsewhere are hearing. Just take a look at this.
Мировой скандал. На Украине обнаружено 30 американских военных биолабораторий, где разрабатывали бактерии.
So that is a clip from Russian state TV, where they are alleging that the US is funding bioweapons labs to study the genetic code of Ukrainians to learn more about Russians. The claim being that that shows the US that the US thinks Russia and Ukraine are one country. Jenny, this is the kind of thing people in Russia are hearing. Is it the kind of thing they're believing?
It's really hard to quantify, but yeah, a lot of people take this as truth, absolutely. And I think what's really important to understand is that Vladimir Putin is seeking to justify what he's doing in Ukraine by framing it as defensive action. So he's there to defend the interests of the Russian-speaking populations in eastern Ukraine against what he deems the aggression of the government in Kyiv. But he's also telling Russians that this is about protecting Russia from NATO, from Ukraine, from everything that you saw in that clip there. And I think people are believing it. We're starting to see footage of not that they call it war, as you know, but pro-war demonstrations in Russian cities. That's starting to be shown on television with that symbol, that Z symbol, which has come to symbolise Russia's actions in Ukraine. What we don't see are any of the anti-war protests that are happening. Just overnight, we heard from an independent monitoring group that more than 850 people were detained across 37 different Russian cities for taking part in demonstrations. And that is happening almost daily here, those demonstrations. And as you say, you know, what Russians who watch state TV are seeing is not what you see at home in the West. You know, they are not seeing very much in the way of strikes outside of eastern Ukraine. The pictures tend to come from eastern Ukraine, from that Donbass area. And you don't see, for example, strikes on the maternity hospital in Mariupol, which the Kremlin has dismissed as fake news.
What about the impact of sanctions, this economic squeeze on Russia? How are people feeling about that? And of course, we've seen big firms, Instagram, for example, not operating in Russia anymore.
Yeah, the Kremlin's official line is, look, we were expecting sanctions, we're prepared for them. We know that they're starting to squeeze. The finance ministry over the weekend said that half of Russia's reserves, foreign reserves, have now been frozen. For the time being, whilst this is all over the front pages of the newspapers, you know, sanctions are going to start taking effect. One newspaper front page this morning said, for example, they're going to hurt the West more than they're going to hurt us. That's a very popular narrative here. Vladimir Putin so far is sort of telling everyone, you know, we've got measures in place to deal with unemployment. People are starting to lose their jobs. And it's going to be probably some weeks, really, before your average Russian starts to notice the deep economic pain that every Western analyst says, you know, is likely to be consequent from these sanctions. But for now, Vladimir Putin is trying to reassure people, and it may get more difficult, of course. But, you know, the point at which it does get difficult for Russians is probably, well, the Kremlin are already doing this, but probably the point at which the Kremlin will turn around and say, this is the West, this is Western aggression against Russia, not explaining that this is in response to, well, we don't call it a war here, as you know.
Okay.
But, you know, this is not in response to the actions in Ukraine.
OK, Jenny Hill there, thank you so much. Emily, do you think the West is just kidding itself that it can win the battle for hearts and minds in Russia?
Well, I think that there's a difference in, and I'm sure Jenny would agree, there's a difference in terms of generations, and, you know, the younger generation can get access to information in a way that the older generation, who are much more dependent on television, are, and obviously therefore it kind of underlines yet again the importance of, you know, businesses such as this one, you know, the BBC being able to broadcast into Russia, but just making sure that information does get out there, and those that are getting that information can see that, you know, the senior security chiefs have been sacked over the weekend. I mean, that is a sign things are not going well. They've lost so many senior generals. There will be conscripts coming back in body bags. You know, people, there is no avoiding that. You know, they are losing people, and so I think and then as I've said at the end, you know, in the end, they will also, I think, ordinary Russians will begin to get the impact of the economic sanctions. So all of those things together, I think, word does get round and will trickle round as a result.
Robert, is there a risk that the economic sanctions are actually counterproductive?
I think this is a very difficult one because you think it's hurting individual Russians who've got nothing to do with this. But on balance, I think it's the right thing to do. And if more, you know, it hits the Russians economically, I think more and more Russians will then ask what on earth is going on. If they are, as your correspondent just pointed out, sadly losing their jobs, if there are panic supermarket buying, they can't order on Amazon anymore, they can't order taxis because the credit cards don't work, they can't use, as I understand it, parts of Google. I think that's when more and more people will raise questions. But I think Emily's point is very important in the sense that if there are tragically body bags going and families losing their loved ones and all these young people being sent to war and thousands coming back, if anything is going to cause an upset, I think that would.
I'm sorry to rush you. We have hardly any time, but I want to get your thoughts, Stephen and Natasha, on whether or not the West need to offer Putin some sort of way of climbing down.
Very quickly, yes. There has to be some space in which he can claim something from this hellish venture. And frankly, the sooner the better. But he has to claim something. Now, what that space is, I'm not qualified to say, but there has to be some kind of space for that to happen.
Natasha?
I think you're right, but also, we shouldn't be, making sure that we're not giving in to Putin in any way. This, you can't be allowed to be rewarding his aggression, but equally, he's got to be able to use something to sort of step down. Otherwise, he's just going to continue escalating.
OK, look, thank you all very much. Of course, this is something that we will continue to discuss because, as you've all said, this is likely to be a protracted conflict, so we will come back to it. But that's all we've got time for today. So thank you to all of my panel and all my guests, Richard Bamber and Jenny Hill, who joined us from Moscow. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15, but until then, have a very good afternoon. And from all of us at Politics Live, goodbye.